Hello and welcome to the Daily Racing Form webinar about the Belmont Stakes and the $1.5 million guaranteed pick 4 supporting the Belmont Stakes. This webinar is brought to you by Daily Racing Form and sponsored by NYRA. A real pleasure to be joined by some fantastic guests today. We have with us the New York handicapper for Daily Racing Form. You've seen him on the fantastic videos he does with Dan Illman on the DRF site. One of the most respected handicappers in New York. I know there are professional players out there who don't want to play races in New York until they've read Mike Beyer's analysis. That's the amount of respect that he commands. It's fantastic to have you with us, Mike Beyer.
Thank you very much, guys. I'm happy to be here.
And we are also joined by our webinar stalwart this Triple Crown season. He's the best-selling handicapper of all time. He makes the figures that largely create the market for horse racing in America. He's a legend, and he's also just a fantastic guest, always full of incisive comments about the current state of form of whichever horse you want to talk about. He is Andy Beyer. Andy, how are you today?
I am great. Incisive, maybe wrong frequently. Let's hope we have a good day today.
And we're also joined on this webinar series, as always on the webinars we do here at DRF, by @DRF Formulator himself, Mike Hogan. Mike, what's happening?
I'm just excited. Belmont Stakes is tomorrow. I'm excited for the webinar. I want to hear what Mike and Andy have to say. So let's get to it.
I love it. Before we start off with the Just a Game and race 8 at Belmont from Saturday, I just want to let folks know that you can ask us questions at any time during the webinar. Mike will be looking for your questions, and we'll talk about them either at an appropriate time while we're discussing the individual races, or perhaps at the end. You can use the tool within the webinar software to ask these questions, and we'll get to as many as we can.
And guys, we might tell our audience that we're going to go through the whole pick 4, breezing through the first 3 legs and then focusing on the Belmont.
You nailed it. He's not only a guest on the show, he's also the producer. That's how good of a guest he is. Yeah. Well, so let's quickly start with our thoughts on these undercard races, beginning with the Just a Game. Mike, we'll start with you. What is your approach to this race going to be?
My approach is that I think there's going to be a pretty good pace in this race. That's how I first approached it. I think they're going to be going up front, especially with my Miss Sophia in here, who, she's clearly good enough to win this race, but to me, she fairly bombed off the layoff last time, and I don't really like her in here, but I think she ensures a fast pace. I thought this race was pretty tough. I'm a little even disappointed in myself, actually, that I wound up picking Mrs. McDougal on top in this race. A horse who I've never been that big of a fan of. This is my thinking on it. And I didn't realize that she was being a terrible morning line maker myself, picking this race before the lines came out. I didn't see her as the favorite in this race, but she is the morning line favorite. So we'll see what happens. I wouldn't bet her if she wasn't the favorite in the race, but I just think she's a progressive filly for Chad Brown, just even going back to her races last year, and some of them are very good. She just seemed to me like a horse who was more of a work in progress than anything else. And I think this is a great distance for her. I don't think she wants to go really a step past a mile. So I think this is a good distance for her. And I thought she'd get a good trip in this race, so I picked her. We'll see how they bet the race. I think Recepta deserves to be the favorite. She has excuses for her last 2 races. She ran well both times. And I think she's a huge player in this race and would use her in every bet that I made. And just for, sort of a better priced option, Belmont has 2. I think Celestine's good enough to win. And I'm concerned about where she's been since April 2nd, and there's a little bit of a gap in her work tab. Maybe something went wrong with her. I think Mott's other horse, Lady Lara, can upset this race at a big price. She has a terrible post, but she wants a clean run into a fast pace, and she hasn't had that in her last 2 starts. If she catches a pace here and she can get a clean run into it, I think she can beat this field at a really good price.
And Belmont has 3. Oh, Belmont has my Miss Sophia as well. So.
Oh yeah, she's the one I didn't care for. That's true. You're right.
Yeah.
Andy, what do you think about the Just a Game?
My 3 numbers in here for pick 4 purposes are 5, 9, and a little 2. I think that the major fact about this race is that in truth, despite its billing, it's not remotely a grade 1 field. I mean, the horse with the top figure in here, Strike Charbers, won like 2 grade 3s, at the age of 6. I mean, this, these are not true grade 1 horses, and for that reason, I really have to respect the European Invader, Irish rookie. I mean, she ran it, against some heavy hitters in Europe. Urvedya, the winner of the grade 1 Coronation Stakes at Royal, one of the big races over there. I mean, she's just got to have a class edge in here. But I'm also going to give a big shot in here to the horse that Mike Beyer doesn't like, My Miss Sophia. I mean, the race where off a long layoff, she rocketed to the lead in the Beaugay last time and faded. But that's not necessarily her running style. I think that's kind of an aberration. I mean, this mare has ran 3 straight times against Teppan. She was never disgraced. I think on just on those class grounds, I mean, any horse who can kind of be in a within a couple lengths of the best, maybe the best turf mare in the world, deserves some respect. And I think that bad last line is going to throw people off her. As with Mike, I certainly used Recepta. She had significant trouble last time, but I just don't think she's as good as the other 2.
Let's move on to race 9. It's the Met Mile, going a mile, obviously, on the dirt. A storied race. While this maybe isn't one of the more storied runnings, it is a very interesting handicapping puzzle. We had a couple of early scratches in here, Mike. Is that right?
That's true. Oh, sorry. I'm not sure which Mike you meant.
Oh, sorry. I meant Mike Hogan. That was right.
Yeah, that's true. El Kabir is going to go to the Stephen Foster instead, so we'll scratch him. And then also Jeremy Noseda had tweeted out earlier today that Sloan Avenue has a quarter crack, so he's out as well. So we'll use Formulator to scratch them, now down to an 11-horse field.
Mike Beyer, who do you like in the race?
I went in a direction, I guess, sort of against the obvious and likely kinds of horses. I know that Frosted is the horse to beat. I just don't particularly like him that much in this race. Maybe the 1-turn mile works for him. But I don't know. His last race in the Dubai World Cup, not that he had to win, but he was pretty disappointed in that race. He didn't really do any running at all. And I don't know that he's necessarily going to be better at a 1-turn mile than he is as a 2-turn router. The last time they ran him around 1 turn on dirt, he was a 2-year-old against maidens, and he hasn't done it since. I don't really need him as the favorite in this race. If I'm playing the pick 4, I'm using him somewhere, but I just thought he was a good favorite to try and beat in this sequence. I gave a long look to Upstart in here, and I think he's an interesting horse if he can get back to one of his really good races. I think he's more of a 1-turn mile kind of horse anyway. A horse who, listen, he ran 105 and 108 as an early 3-year-old, and obviously the Derby was a disaster, and the second half of his 3-year-old year was basically non-existent, but he's come back and shown that he at least can still run competitively as a 4-year-old in his 2 starts at Oaklawn. He had no chance in the Oaklawn Handicap last time, a race that had 0 pace on. He was last, coming wide and racing on. I think the 1-turn mile works for him, and I think if they can get him back off the pace and make 1 run in here, I think he can be a factor in this race at a good price, and so I picked him. And I also like Calculator a bit in this race. I think the 1-turn mile works for him too, and I think he'll be further away from the pace this time than he was last time. So they were the sort of the 2 horses that I was focusing on.
Andy, are you in agreement with Mike's view of this race, or do you have a contrarian?
No, not at all. I mean, I should say about Upstart, he never recovered from the Beyer curse when I picked him to win the Kentucky Derby. I mean, well, he only lost by 60 that day, but he's really never done anything since. But so you can blame me for that. Listen, I want to preface my comments here by saying I am not a slave to the Beyer speed figures. When I see a horse who runs a giant figure in his last, if I think the horse has had a perfect setup, I'm quite willing to and eager to go against big figure horses if they earn the figure with a real favorable trip. Having said that, Noble Bird earned the biggest Beyer speed figure of 2016 when he won at Pimlico on Preakness weekend. And to me, that the figure is legitimate and the race was legitimate. I mean, the field wasn't much, but I mean, there was a fast front runner in there. He pressed him. He drew away. He buried the field. He's now coming into a race where nobody is all that good, and that race, his last race was no fluke. I mean, he'd run a figure of 108 last year, so it's not like that came out of the blue and was a kind of a necessarily a one-time deal. I mean, at 9-2 in the line, I mean, I'm morally obligated to bet this horse. I mean, I don't see why Frosted should be the favorite in here, or what his claim to fame is. I mean, this is a horse who won the Pennsylvania Derby, who won the Wood, against a kind of a very forgettable field, and that's about it for his main lifetime achievements. I mean, why, what? I don't get him, and he would not be on my tickets.
Just to recap the Met, that's number 4, Noble Bird for Andy. Mike going to take a shot with number 6, Upstart, and number 11, Calculator. Everybody trying to beat morning line favorite Frosted, number 5. Let's move on to the Manhattan. Very competitive running with presumably a very big favorite. Mike Beyer, what are your thoughts?
I don't know. I mean, I suppose if Flincher shows up and runs his best race, he'll just win. Certainly, if he runs his Sword Dancer, he'll just win. This is a better field than the Sword Dancer field that he beat, but I don't know, man. He's likely better than these horses. I suppose if you wanted to beat him at some point this year for Chad Brown, you do it on Saturday because he's just kicking off his campaign. It didn't seem like they were really pointing for this race. It just seems like all of a sudden they breezed him last week. They liked his breeze. They're going to run him. But he's just likely better than these horses. If you're against him, I don't know how easy it is to separate the rest of them. I wanted to give one of Chad's other horses though another chance in this race, and I know Slumber beat a much worse field last year in this race than the field that he's facing this year. But he's a 1.25 mile horse. He doesn't want to go 1.5 miles. The 1.1 1/8 that they've tried him at several times is not a good distance for him. It's a little too short for him. He likes 1.25 miles. I think he can get the right trip in there. He needs a trip. He's one of those horses who tends to find trouble. That's a problem. But if he can work out the kind of trip that he got in this race last year, I think he can win, and I think it'll be a good price. And he was, sort of my other horse in the race. I like World Approval a little bit too. I just am worried about 1.25 miles for him. I don't think he really wants to go this far, but he's a much improved horse as a 4-year-old, and he's going to get a great trip in this race.
Andy?
Gee, I mean, Flincher just looks like he's in a class by himself in here. I mean, he's run against some of the best horses in the world. I mean, he earned the biggest Beyer speed figure on turf in a long, long time when he won at Saratoga last year. And obviously both Slumber and Big Blue Kitten, the other Chad Brown horses, have got real good form last year. And I will say this for Slumber. I mean, his last race, wasn't that great. But I mean, he is 0 for 6 lifetime at races at 1.1 miles or less. So he certainly, as Mike said, he wants to go farther. But Visually, I didn't find his race particularly impressive last time. And you got to, one. I mean, he and Big Blue Kitten are both 8 years old now. I mean, can we really kind of count on them after one prep race to bounce back to their career best form? I don't know. I'm just not going to get creative and try to beat Flincher here.
Sounds like Flincher is the consensus pick amongst our panel as well. Mike Hogan, you had an interesting stat regarding Flincher, one that I didn't give much credence when we talked about it on the DRF Players podcast, but I'm curious what Mike Beyer and Andy Beyer think, if you happen to have that stat handy.
Well, I'll pull it up right now. This is just graded stakes in the last 2 years on the NYRA circuit with Javier Castellano aboard. Chad Brown has had 25 runners. He's only had 1 win, which is surprising to me. When I saw that, I was kind of shocked. Obviously, he rides Ira Ortiz quite a bit. Joe Bravo has been on Big Blue Kitten. It was more of a surprising stat, and more, I think the takeaway was 17 of those 25 were 5-1 or lower. So the market tends to really, really overvalue those horses and bet them pretty heavily. No surprise considering the connections. Andy or Mike, either of you have put any credence into that stat, or is that just a bit of an anomaly that's going to get turned into 2 for 26 on Saturday?
I don't know. I'll leave it to Andy. If you're talking about jockeys for the most part, you're talking about
No, I was going to leave that to you. This just sounds like, look, there's a statistic for everything, and I just can't believe, that Chad would be thinking, boy, this horse really isn't ready. He needs a race. He's going to bum. We'll get Castellano over this and stick him with this bum. No, this is a fluky statistic.
That was sort of the consensus we came to as well. All right, well, we're ready to move on to the main event here. We're going to take a horse-by-horse look at the Belmont Stakes. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the distinctive nature of this race and some of the horses who are typically best suited to it. Andy, I know you have some thoughts on this matter.
I do, and when people talk about what types of horses are suited to the Belmont, they talk about whether speed horses versus come from behind horses. To me, having watched Belmont stakes for 50 years, my first one was in fact 1966. I do have this observation. I think it's this race is best understood if you can contrast it to the Kentucky Derby. When you think of the types of horses who win the Derby, they're so often, horses who make kind of big moves at some point in the race, usually on the final turn, and seize command. And you can reel off a long list of them. Orb, Mind That Bird, Real Quiet, Strike the Gold, Unbridled, Pleasant Colony, even a bum like Gatto del Sol. They made those big eye-catching moves, and yet all of the aforementioned horses did not win the Belmont. And the Derby is traditionally run by the horse who does in fact kind of take command going into the stretch. It's not rarely kind of won in the in the last gasp. But at the Belmont, horses who have that big turn of foot and can seize command of a race usually don't do well, because they make that move and they turn into the stretch, and they still have literally to run into the next county. And when you think of of some of the great failures in the Belmont Stakes, they were horses who tried to unleash a mid-race or top of the stretch run, and got caught. Of course, more famously, Kent DeSormo on Real Quiet, Ronnie Franklin on Spectacular Bid, Stuart Elliott on Smarty Jones. the ability to unleash sharp acceleration is not an asset in the Belmont. And this is typical. The race is typically won by horses with a more even-paced style. I mean, a quintessential example was, was American Pharoah last year. I mean, he ran his first quarter in 24 seconds. The next 5 quarters were all within like a tick of 24 and 2. He just boom, boom, boom. Just a nice steady pace, and that's the style that wins the Belmont, and whether it's horses on the lead or coming from behind, and it's one of the reasons that I'm a little skeptical about the favorite on Saturday, because you look at Exaggerator's wins. He made the bold move to take command in the Preakness, bold move to take command in the Santa Anita Derby. Not the running style that I want in the Belmont.
Well, that's very interesting information to keep in mind as we look through the field. Before we get to that, I also just wanted to follow up, Andy, asking about the speed figures that Belmont winners typically earn. Many handicappers have noted that the figures have been coming back pretty low the last few years. What do you attribute that to?
Well, first of all, when we see things about our figures that look funny, we go back and review them from a historical standpoint. Look at our calculations and just say, I mean, we're willing to say, hey, this is wrong, we got to change it. I mean, we totally revised, all of our turf figures last year. But in the Belmont, I mean, I think our figures are right on, and they really say something about kind of American racing. I mean, it used to be, that the Belmont, just like the Derby and the Preakness, was typically won by figures of 110 and higher. Since 2008, the average winning figure in the race has been a 98. The best was American Pharoah last year with a perfect trip and a 105. And I don't think it's too much of a secret that for the reason is that nobody in America breeds horses to run 1.5 miles anymore. And in fact, horses who are 1.5 mile horses get shunned at stud. I mean, Belmont winners are exiled to the farthest parts of the globe. I mean, Deterra was standing at stud in Venezuela. I mean, Victory Gallop is in Turkey. Nobody wants them, and so you just have fields of horses who can't go the distance, and that's the reason the Belmont has produced so many crazy upsets in the last decade. That it's a real crapshoot for a handicapper to try to guess who's going to get 1.5 miles and who's not. And so that huge unknown factor, makes me very wary of taking short prices in the race.
Mike Beyer, how important is the distance for you when you're looking at a race like this? Does it take on a much bigger role than it does when you're handicapping a typical stakes race throughout the year?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's just, especially in races like this, where it's just hard to know who's really going to want the distance and who's going to improve if they have to improve. I don't know. I just think in a lot of ways, these races come down to not necessarily who the best horse is, just who the best horse who's suited to the distance is. And it's not easy to tell who that's going to be. I do sort of feel like, just from listening to what Andy just said, and I agree with all of it, it seems to me that Exaggerator, even if he's the best horse, he seems particularly unsuited to 1.5 miles to me.
That's interesting. Let's go through the field here, and we'll obviously pause when we get to Exaggerator, and I'll follow up then, Mike Beyer, with what exactly you meant by that comment. Let's start with number 1, Governor Malibu. Mike Beyer, we'll keep it with you. Bears some superficial resemblance to 2 years ago's Belmont Stakes winner, Toneless, being sent out by the same trainer and having run in the same prep race. Do you see anything here that makes you want to put Governor Malibu on your ticket?
Not really, although at least he's improving. You could do worse than to take a horse who's improving at the right time. I thought he ran fine in the Peter Pan, and I think the horse that beat him's a good horse, but I don't know. He still is going to have to run a lot better than he ran in that race where, to me, he just got a perfect trip and was a game second best in there. He's a pretty cool horse, and he's improving at the right time. I just don't particularly like him tomorrow.
Andy, will he be on your ticket?
His pre-Peter Pan races were all kind of weak, and in the Peter Pan, I mean, Unified certainly looked like a horse who was kind of, running out of gas trying to get a mile and an eighth. So I don't think this was necessarily a really great, impressive charge by Governor Malibu. I respect Clement doing almost anything, but I don't think I can use this horse.
Number 2 is Destin. Andy, we talked about this horse a lot in advance of the Kentucky Derby on our webinar. Where do you stand with Destin today?
Despite his good figures, I didn't really like him in the Derby, particularly off that 2-month layoff. I guess looking at his numbers at Tampa Bay, 198, you could say, this horse, has figures that could, make him a contender in here, but I just didn't really like those fields at Tampa Bay, and there's nothing in here, at least in his races, that make me think that this horse is, crying out for a mile and a half.
Mike, what are your thoughts on Destin?
Yeah, sort of the same. I mean, I kind of wanted to leave him open in this race. But the more I look at him, it's funny because I feel like, I don't know what I was expecting in the Derby. I didn't particularly like him in that race, but I actually felt like he kind of ran okay considering he was off of a 2-month layoff. Yeah, he didn't run terrible in the Derby, so I thought he could have been an interesting Preakness horse. And of course, because Pletcher refuses to run them back in the Preakness, they didn't go in that race. Maybe he caught a break in some ways because he missed a race over a really wet track with a really fast pace. But if he got lucky and missing, but if they did the right thing by skipping it, I think they just got lucky in doing it, that the race turned out that way. And I really don't think I want him at a mile and a half. I wanted to leave him open, but I just don't think he's going to be a great price, and I don't know if I want him at a mile and a half.
Mike Hogan, one of the things I was interested to see with Destin is how Todd Pletcher famously likes to have a lot of time between his horses' races, how he does coming back with what qualifies for a wheelback by his own personal standards, bringing a horse back in a graded stakes race in 3 weeks. We looked at the numbers before on the podcast, and they were kind of small and inconclusive, but do you remember what they were?
Yeah, I'm looking at them right now. Last 5 years, 78 runners, 15 wins, 31 in the money, so that's 19% win rate, 40% in the money. $1.65 ROI, which is just kind of average, I guess, a tick below the 168 that Pletcher has for all of his runners in the last 5 years. So kind of inconclusive, nothing too positive, but if you like Destin here and can make a case in the second start off that layoff, not enough to knock the pick.
Let's move on.
If I may, let me just add one thing to that. Pletcher laying this horse off for like 8 weeks going into the Derby, even though that might be his style, it's really a losing move in the Kentucky Derby. You need horses who are fitter and tighter than that, whereas the recent history of the Belmont has shown that going from the Derby to the Belmont is a very successful move. So, this horse certainly is better prepared for this race than he was for the last one.
That's right. I realized I was using my Stradivari stat for
Yes.
Gettysburg.
Yes.
So
That's
Gettysburg,
okay, though.
of course, does not have 3 weeks. He has the move as
It's 5
Andy
weeks.
pointed out, that's been so successful in recent years. Let's move on to number 3, Cherry Wine. He was, of course, second in the Preakness. Andy, will Cherry Wine be on your tickets?
You know, this 3-year-old season, this 3-year-old campaign has been very unusual in that almost every race has featured an extremely hot pace where closers come from 10 miles behind. I mean, this was true in a lot of the prep races, and it was true in the first 2 legs of the Triple Crown. And when I look at horses like Cherry Wine, Sudden Breaking News, Brody's Cause, Creator, to me, they're all the same horse. I mean, they clunked up after a hot pace, still, didn't win. I mean, I don't like any of them. I mean, this is, I mean, they all look, like a horse like Cherry Wine, who made up like 20 lengths in the Preakness, and Sudden Breaking News, whom we'll talk about next, making up 20+ lengths in the Derby. Looks good on paper. It really wasn't. I mean, I think these all the horses with this style are sucker bait in the Belmont.
Mike, do you have anything more positive to say about Cherry Wine?
I agree with everything Andy just said. I mean, Cherry Wine, they all look the same to me, all these closers. I don't want any of them, and I think you don't want Cherry Wine, who, I mean, he comes out of the race where that might look great in the Preakness, where he just had all the best of it and was sort of a suck-along second.
Seems like a last time was the time situation there. Of this group of closers you guys have been referring to, the story seems to be on number 4, Sudden Breaking News, that the jockey booking of Mike Smith suggests they might have a slightly different plan in mind, something more along the galloping, grindy approach that Andy was saying has had success in the past. A horse like Drosselmeyer that Smith rode comes to mind. But looking at the PPs, it's not a certainty that the horse is going to be able to run like that. Do you give that idea, Andy, any credence, or are you anti Sudden Breaking News as well?
Well, I just say ditto to my last comments. I mean, this horse may be the best of the closers. He did have some trouble in the Derby, but he was again, kind of up, in his last 2 races, he had a tremendous pace set up for a horse with his style, and and still didn't do it. I mean, what's this horse really done? I mean, he won the Southwest Stakes. I just don't think he's that good.
Mike, any more optimism with Sudden Breaking News?
Yeah, no, not really. And the problem with him too is I think people will latch on to the Smith thing. Like it might make a difference. And listen, maybe you're right. Maybe they'll try something different with him this time, but then you have to ask yourself the question, can he run effectively with a different style? I don't know if he can. He just has a really, really annoying habit of running too late in his races. And I personally think of all the closers in the Derby, he might have gotten the best trip out of all of them. I thought he got a great ride from Quinones in the Derby, and he was just too late again. I don't know. I think he's going to take, sneaky money in this race, and I would just never take him at any kind of short price.
Another horse. That's right. Another horse who's been talked about as one who is going to take money into the teeth of the big favorite is number 5, Stradivari. That was the stat that we said already about Pletcher having a certain amount of success with horses coming back in 3 weeks in graded stakes, which by his own standards is coming back fairly quickly. It looked like the kind of race in the Preakness that Stradivari might get something out of and be able to move forward. Mike, do you have any optimism about his chances in a test like the Belmont Stakes?
Well, I think if nothing else, you have to be at least somewhat encouraged by his Preakness, if only because of sort of what he was facing. Obviously his 2 wins prior to that were visually impressive, but he wasn't really beating anything. did get a fast figure though at Keeneland, and then, considering it was, a wet track like he had never encountered before, way better horses than he had ever encountered before, a much faster pace than he had ever encountered before. I think he acquitted himself pretty well in the Preakness, even though there was never really a point where it looked like he was going to win. I think he did some good things in there. I picked him in here, recognizing that he's, maybe one of the least interesting horses in the race. I think he's, pretty much, he's at least exposed now, and he maybe wasn't exposed in the Preakness. Now he is, but he's pretty good, and I thought he would, be more that kind of horse Andy was referencing before, where, he's just going to be sort of up there with the right running style for this race, and maybe he can take down Exaggerator on Saturday.
There's a horse in the field who's going to click off 12s. Maybe it is Stradivari. What do you think, Andy?
This is the only horse in the field that I could ever consider betting. I think a huge amount of logic points to him. I mean, going into the Preakness, even though he'd run that big figure of 100 at Keeneland and won by 14 lengths, this horse was just by any kind of traditional training standards was woefully underprepared for for this race. I mean, 3 lifetime starts. He'd never run anything better than bottom level allowance race, and now he gets thrown into the into the Triple Crown race against really well-seasoned horses like Exaggerator and Nyquist. I thought this horse was going to get absolutely buried, and yet, not only did he finish in contention, he was chasing or just sitting a little off of that suicidal pace. Got fanned very wide, turning for home, and when you thought that, okay, he's really ready to pack it in the stretch, he just kept plugging away. I mean, he's a half length behind Nyquist. I think this horse coming back in the Belmont now, it's the fact that Pletcher is doing this is a very positive sign. I mean, the horse has now got the seasoning necessary. I think he's going to win.
Number 6, Gettysburg. Is he anything more than a rabbit in this race, Andy?
I know that's what everybody's saying. I just can't see this horse being a rabbit in the sense that the Ramseys have used for Big Blue Kitten of sending a horse out there by 20 lengths. I mean, here's a horse who's who's a pretty good horse, and I don't see him being a sacrificial lamb in here. I mean, he will go to the front, but I don't think they're going to do anything crazy with him. I mean, if they do, it may change the complexion of the race, but I see this horse going to the lead in 48 or something like that, not in 46. But that's just my guess. I may be dead wrong on that.
Mike Beyer, you think Gettysburg has any chance of sticking around at the end here?
I mean, I tend to doubt it. I will say this about him. His Arkansas Derby 2 starts back, I would argue that he ran better than Creator did, and he ran better than Sudden Breaking News did, and he ran better than a lot of different horses in that race did. The problem is that's really like a one-off for him. His other races just aren't particularly good. I think he's going to be on the lead in here. I don't think he's going to be around at the end.
All right, number 7 is Seeking the Soul. A lot has been made of the success Dallas Stewart has had with some of these long shots in Triple Crown races over the past few years. Do you see a space, Mike Beyer, for Seeking the Soul in the trifecta, perhaps?
I don't. I think that, and I give a lot of credit to Dallas Stewart for getting those horses to perform, whatever the 3 or 4 from however many there are. But I don't understand. I don't think any of that is like any big deal. those horses just happen to be in good situations and sort of take advantage, and that's all well and good. I don't know. This horse looks like it could be okay to me at some point down the line. I don't really see what makes him a Belmont contender.
Andy, any more?
I agree. I like trainer angles as much as anybody, but as Mike said, I mean, Stewart's bombs who've gotten onto the ticket and Triple Crown races have been kind of favored by circumstances, and I don't see any circumstances that could favor this horse.
Reverdoro number 8 looks a lot like Seeking the Soul with poorer Beyer speed figures. Is there anything more to be said, Andy?
I think not.
Mike?
Yeah, I don't see what he's doing in this race.
When we spoke before the Derby, Andy, we talked about Trojan Nation, and we talked specifically about that speed figure that he earned in the Wood Memorial, and how by some standards and even some on your team thought that figure should be lower. If you're going to make a case for Trojan Nation to do something here, I think you kind of have to key off that figure. Where do you stand with that Wood figure now?
Yeah, but it was kind of a it was a tough day. I can't see the Wood Memorial being like a figure in the 80s, based on what the horses had previously run. I mean, I think that 93 is a reasonable number, but clearly it was an unusual effort for this horse, to say the least, and I don't think he deserves much consideration here.
Mike, you see any reason why he'll be a factor in the Belmont Stakes?
No.
Number 10, Lonnie, has attracted an awful lot of attention, certainly in social media, for the combination of his unusual training routine and his occasional studdish bad boy antics. My question for you, Mike Beyer, is there a chance he can maybe transfer some of this impressiveness he's shown in the morning to the afternoon?
Is there a chance? I suppose. I don't know. I feel like I'm being a grouch with Lonnie. Everybody's like, it's like some great story. Everybody's very into him. I don't care about any of it, really. I don't know. I don't really particularly like either of his 2 races since he got over here. I mean, I guess he was wide in the Derby, but when you have 0 early speeds and you're going to try and come from last, you're probably going to be wide. And he was just picking up pieces at the end of that Preakness. I don't think it was any kind of performance to get that excited about. Maybe he'll like the mile and a half more than everybody else, and this race will fall into his lap somehow. I just don't get him.
Andy, what about all the stories circulating Lonnie? Do they make you look twice?
I can see this horse being in the money on Saturday. Unlike the other horses that I derided, who were coming from miles behind in the other, in the other 3-year-old races. I feel I know what Creator and Cherry Wine and those horses are about. And they're just, pick up the pieces plotters who aren't that good. I mean, Lonnie is inscrutable. The people who've watched him every morning still know. He understands him, but clearly he's had these outrageous wide trips, and now when I read Mike Welsh, who in the forum, talking about how suddenly like Lonnie is looking kind of professional and in the mornings, that makes me think this horse deserves a little consideration in here. I agree. He's just, as Mike said, he's just got to clunked up and pick up the pieces off a hot pace. But I wouldn't be shocked if he runs a lot better on Saturday.
One of the many interesting storylines to follow in this race. Number 11, Exaggerator, is your big favorite. I get the sense now. Mike seems like he's sensitive about being a grouch. I don't know. Are you going to get grouchy when I ask you about Exaggerator's chances, Mike?
No, not at all. Listen, to me, he's clearly the horse to beat in here. I don't know. He's one of the better. It's not a great crop of 3-year-olds in my opinion, but he's certainly one of the better ones. And there's no denying he's been a good horse from day one. He just doesn't seem like a 1.5 mile horse to me. You have he's fine on the fast track. There's obviously he can run his race on a fast track. He's not a big wet track horse, but there's no denying that the 2 best races of his life were the Santa Anita Derby and the Preakness on wet tracks. Those races also, had the benefit for him of a wicked fast pace. Both of them did. And so you just get the sense that he took advantage in his 2 big wins. And he's just one of those horses who has, it seems to me, a short burst of speed that he uses. And boy, if that's the case and that's his real running style, DeSormo better time it right in this race. Get him within range and then time it right, because I have a feeling he's going to struggle with the 1.5 miles.
Andy, would he be an A for you in your multi-race exotic plays?
Look, I wouldn't want to be alive in the pick 6 and and have a couple good prices along the way and not have him on my ticket. But for win and exacta betting purposes, I'm just going to go against him. I've stated my case on about his running style, and just going back to the Preakness, here you had a race where there were only 2 horses who could win, and in a race where there were clearly 4 tearaway speed horses who had no chance. Nyquist is sent out of the gate to gun and race a 40-to-1 shot into defeat in a suicidal pace. I consider this the worst ride I have seen in a Triple Crown race in my lifetime as a journalist and racing fan. And
Franklin's off the hook?
Yes, because I can excuse a jockey for doing something wrong in the heat of battle, as Franklin did. The Nyquist team went into the Preakness with this as their strategy. Oh, this horse is so good, we'll just gun out of the gate and get into a suicidal speed duel with anybody who wants to do it. It was nuts. And so, Nyquist eliminated himself. And by the way, I would have bet him enthusiastically in the Belmont. And so Exaggerator, it was in a situation where he couldn't fail. And so do you want to take even money on a horse who's had just such a perfect setup as that? I do not. So I got to go against him.
Mike Beyer, does that price guess sound about right to you? Even money or so on Exaggerator? You think we'll see that come race time on Saturday?
Yeah, I think you probably are going to see something like that. I think he'll be that short of price, and I agree with Andy. I think playing multis, you want to be a little more careful, and especially if you're using price in the other legs. I don't think you want to get knocked out when Exaggerator wins the Belmont, but boy, he seems like a pretty good horse to at least take some kind of shot against in this race.
I don't know where they came up with 9 to 5 for the morning line on this.
Right.
It's not like there's a groundswell of support for any of the other 12 horses.
And I'll jump in and say it's worth noting that Mike Watchmaker has him at 3 to 5 on his morning line. So perhaps somewhere in between is what we'll likely see.
I think the panel has tipped their hands when it comes to the deep closers like number 12, Brody's Cause, and number 13, Creator. But rather than just brush past them, I'll just ask, Andy, in either case, do you have anything that you wanted to add or any pressing reason to maybe elevate those 2 over the other closers we've discussed?
Nope, they're just they're the plotters who look like everybody else.
Mike?
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't have anything really positive to say about either one of them.
All right, Mike Hogan, do we have some questions from the crowd that have come in while we were chatting?
We do, and let's roll it back kind of to the top of this race when we talked about different approaches for a race like the Belmont, which is a bit of an anomaly. It's 12 furlongs. It's not the kind of race that these horses are likely to run again. They've certainly never run this far before. So we've got a few different questions sort of along those lines. Jim O'Neill wants to know how important is the jockey in a race at 1.5 miles, or even today's card and tomorrow's card, up to a 2-mile race, which you don't see very often. Are certain jockeys more proficient at longer distances, or is race time strategy more the key to success here? Andy, let's start with you.
You know, I'm not a guy who focuses that much on jockeys, but clearly the Belmont is a race that requires good judgment. I mean, because we have seen in the case of particularly in the case of horses going for the Triple Crown, some of the worst judged rides. So not only some of the ones we've mentioned, but I thought the ride on California Chrome was ridiculous, and well, there's just a long list. I mean, I could, being a jockey hater at heart, I could make a long roster of, but you're just you're just never sure who's going to do the smart thing and who's not. But like established pros like Castellano or Mike Smith, I mean, I would be a little more comfortable with than some other people.
Mike, your take?
You were saying before you're not really a jockey guy, but in extreme scenarios like these, is that an exception, or are you still not too focused on the ride?
It's not an exception. I mean, listen, in the event that they matter at all, the longer races, I think, is probably the ones where they can make, some kind of a difference. Personally, I just don't care who rides the horses that I like.
All right. Kind of along those lines in terms of distance, do either of you use dosage index at all when handicapping the Belmont? Steve Cortege wants to know that.
I mean, wasn't dosage discredited about 20 years ago? It really.
Where do you even find it anymore? I don't even know where you can find it.
It was once sort of the vogue, but I'll tell you, even looking at pedigrees in a more intelligent fashion, I'm not sure, helps you that. Would have helped you that much in recent Belmonts. I mean, got American Pharaoh. His female family looked like he couldn't possibly go 1.5 miles, and yet that was probably the best 1.5 mile performance we've seen in the last decade. So the pedigree factor confounds me.
It's funny.
Is there any data that you look at specifically for pedigree, or are you sort of in the same boat there?
No, and it's funny because I'm a big believer in pedigree for racing overall, but it's odd that as far as the Triple Crown races, where it feels like most people focus on pedigree, I don't care about it at all. I don't really think that makes any difference at all. But I'm just in an everyday sort of fashion in handicapping, I think it's really important, but just not in these races. I don't think it really points you anywhere.
Jim O'Neill has another question. I'll start with you, Mike, since you follow the circuit much more closely on a daily basis. At Belmont, is the inside post position or the far outside post position a problem? Do you upgrade or downgrade based on post position, especially for a race like the Belmont Stakes?
I don't think in the Belmont post position it's going to matter at all. For different distances, obviously, you want to be more aware of post position, but for 1.5 miles on the main track here, I don't think it makes any difference at all.
All right, unless Andy disagrees, I'll keep moving on. Aaron Shapiro has a question about using statistics. He says everyday handicappers use them, and many will use statistics to fit their own opinions. What he likes to do is look at recency in terms of trainers, because some will reel off hot streaks in the short term, even ones that aren't necessarily high percentage winning trainers. What do you guys think of that approach? Is that something that you will pay extra attention to, or is that maybe short-term, small sample size anomaly?
Well, it could, it can be a short-term anomaly with a guy just getting a couple horses in the right spot and winning with logical horses. On the other hand, if two or three recent horses have suddenly improved their speed figures by 30 points, and you might be suspicious enough to say, hey, he's got the juice now. So, we're all suspicious, and if you see guys who get, hot in a very suspicious kind of way, that may be a factor.
Yeah, right. I try not to get too caught up in going through trainer stats or any kind of stats like that. I mean, I certainly look at them. I don't want to get too caught up in them. I'm much more interested in trying to get an idea of what trainers do well. Some trainers just do some things well and sort of get an idea about that and sort of keep it in mind, but I don't really want to get caught up looking up a bunch of trainer stats for races. I just think it's, in a lot of ways, at the end of the day, it's a big waste of time.
All right, real quick question about racing on the Belmont surface. Dennis Passaretti wants to know, any advantage to a race over the track?
I don't think it's a disadvantage. I mean, I don't know how much it really matters, but it certainly can't hurt to have one.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the idea of a race over the track, in most cases is, kind of an old discredited canard of handicapping. I mean, at least I don't believe in it.
I think we have time for one more, Mike, if you have one more.
Yeah, it's a nice little historical one that, Andy, I think you've written about, actually. It's Jason Myers wants to know about Secretariat's Belmont. Must have been the highest speed figure recorded if you were doing speed figures back then. Is that the case? And if so, do you have any sort of estimate as to what that number might have earned?
Some years ago, I mean, it's very tough to do because our figures weren't. My figures were not mature at that point. I did, and it's sort of hard to kind of recreate all the factors going into some old race and getting all the data. When I look back and try to apply modern day standards to that Belmont, my best guess was a figure of 139. In that with his big margin, that it would make the second place horse 100. And in that era, horses were going to run 100, in the Belmont Stakes. So that kind of makes sense to me. I do think it is the best race of all time from a speed figure standpoint.
That's great. That's a great question. Thanks for asking that one, and thanks for providing that, Andy. It's a great thing to think about. Always nice to get to attach some extra data to the legendary racing stories, and kind of fun when the data matches the visual impression in a race like that. Really, really very cool stuff. Mike Hogan, anything else? Any other questions that can't wait? Anything we could do really quickly, or are we pretty much at the end of the queue there?
Well, real quick, and Andy, you can say anything if you want. Guy Keys wants to know if anybody uses the Moss Pace figures. I know you do. I know I do. So we can leave it at that unless you have anything else, Andy, you want to say about them.
I do regularly. I think they're very good. Making pace figures, and I've experimented with it myself, is really difficult. But I mean, just the very least to give you a sense of, of what was a fast pace and what wasn't. And I depend on them quite a bit.
Excellent. That's right, because in addition to the numbers themselves, there's also that sort of more anecdotal approach written into the line where it will at least tell you very quickly how fast a race was early, middle, and late. That's sort of maybe a good training wheels way for folks who are looking to incorporate more pace and pace figures into their handicapping to start looking at those. If you're interested in more about the Moss pace figures, Mike Hogan and I have done a webinar with Randy before. You can find that and all of our webinars, including an archive of this one, at drf.com/YouTube. Obviously, this one, it'll take a little while before it can be archived up there. But if you want to check back later, write down some more numbers, help formulate your own plays, that would be a good place to do it. And that's all the time we have here on the Daily Racing Form webinar, sponsored by NYRA, about the $1.5 million guaranteed Pick 4 on Belmont Day. I think everybody on this call is going to be playing. Hopefully everybody out there watching and listening will be as well. I want to thank Mike Beyer. I want to thank Andy Beyer. I want to thank Mike Hogan. I want to thank our producer, Charlie Zeggers, as always. Thanks most of all to all of you for joining us. We really appreciate it. You've been watching a webinar produced by drf.com.